Thank you very much, Dr. Swift, for that very generous introduction. I want to thank Robert Rabel also for all the work and hospitality that he has shown in bringing us to this evening. And of course, I want to thank my fellow commentator on science and religion, Jerry Coyne, for being here as well. And thank all of you. Dr. Swift gave you one definition of theology. Maybe not everybody has heard the other definition of a theologian. That is, a theologian is someone who doesn't make much money, but at least he knows why. And I should add that for many years I tried instead very hard to become a philosopher. But cheerfulness kept breaking in, and so I had to become a theologian. Well, for many years, I've been very interested in this question of the relationship between religion and theology on the one hand and natural sciences on the other. And I think, just to come right to the point, what is really interesting about this question is that they are about something I think most people are interested in. They all come down to the question whether the universe that we live in can said in this day and age plausibly to have something like a purpose. Now, by purpose, I mean something very simple. A purpose means bringing about something of self-evident value. We can think of our own lives, for example, as purposeful if we see them as contributing to a lasting value, like peace, justice, love, truth, and so forth. But my question is, and this is a question that's raised by many scientific thinkers, is there anything comparable, anything of lasting value working itself out in this vast universe that science has given us recently? Now, you might say, well, why should I bother about the question of cosmic purpose? And a lot of people would say we shouldn't. It's too vast for us. We shouldn't talk about it. But I just want to tell you that there are a lot of people who think we should talk about it. One of them, great American philosopher W.T. Stace, says this. He says, if the whole scheme of things, meaning the whole cosmos, is pointless, then because of the intricate way in which the lives of each one of us is woven into this cosmos, something that we know more about in more detail today than ever before, then so our individual lives. We're so tied up with the universe, as we know today from science, that if we judge it to be pointless, doesn't that say something about the meaning and significance of our own lives? And I was delighted to hear from the great former president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, very thoughtful man. He says, in a number of ways he says this in different places, the crisis of the much-needed global responsibility, and he's talking about not only political but ecological responsibility, is due to the fact that we, when he means modern thought and modern culture, has lost the sense that the universe has a purpose. And if you ask the religions of the world, and especially the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they would say it's very important to talk about cosmic purpose because they all believe that the universe, not just humans, but the universe is here for a reason as well. But doesn't science rule out any plausible notion of cosmic purpose today? And with it, all hints of any divine personal presence. Steven Weinberg thinks so in a very famous statement from his book, The First 3 Minutes. He says, the more comprehensible, meaning the more scientifically comprehensible the universe has become, the more pointless it also seems. Richard Feynman, another very thoughtful 20th century physicist, said the great accumulation of understanding as to how the physical world behaves only convinces one that this behavior has a kind of meaninglessness about it. Margaret Geller, astronomer at Harvard, asked to comment on Steven Weinberg's claim, says, of course, what point? It's just a physical system. And another great physicist, Woody Allen, says, he begs to differ a little bit. He says there is a kind of intelligence in the universe, with the exception of certain parts of New Jersey. If you ask the classical theologies, going back to antiquity, they would say, yes, of course the cosmos is purposeful. It was easier for them to think of the cosmos as meaningful because it was arranged in their mind possibly due to Plato as much as anybody else, in a static, vertical, hierarchical way, with matter, lowly matter at the bottom, then plant above that, then animal, then human consciousness, then perhaps angelic spheres, and then ultimately superintended by God, or ultimate reality and meaning. This scheme operates according to what you might call the hierarchical principle. The hierarchical principle maintains that a higher level in this hierarchy can encompass and comprehend the lower, but the lower cannot comprehend, encompass, or get itself around the higher. That's the way the universe works in the classical theological schemes. And that would mean, therefore, that understanding a lower level or gaining cognitional competence at one of the lower levels does not qualify you to talk about the higher levels or to say anything deep about them. And that's because almost all the traditional religions and theologies required something that's sort of dropped out of modern discussion, and that's the need to undergo personal transformation as a condition for putting your mind or your heart or your personality in touch with the higher levels. Just being smart, having a high IQ is not enough for you to get a sense of the higher dimensions of reality. You could also think of these dimensions not necessarily stacked hierarchically, but as circles within circles. This is just one of many possible diagrams of what I'm talking about. But the point is, the more important and the more valuable something is in the scheme of things, the more elusive and unavailable it is to the lower levels, or to be understood by an analysis of the lower levels, so that you could become an expert in physical chemistry or physics and chemistry at the material level, but that wouldn't qualify you to say what life really is, let alone what mind is, let alone what God is. And what that would imply, as far as my conversation this afternoon is concerned, is that if there is an ultimate meaning or purpose to things, it would by definition lie beyond human comprehension because of the hierarchical principle. We are a lower level in the hierarchies, therefore we can't get our minds around the higher. However, the traditional theological schemes allowed that it is possible to have an awareness of being grasped by the higher level. And the name that theologians give to that awareness of being grasped by ultimate reality is faith. So there is a kind of evidence for faith, but it's not a controlling scientific type of evidence. It's the evidence that comes from the experience of being carried away by something very large, very important, of ultimate value. And since faith and the human mind cannot ever get a clear bead on the ultimate dimension of reality, by definition, they have to use a kind of language proportionate to that fact, and that means the language of symbol, metaphor, and analogy. Those are the languages or the terms, the kind of language or discourse that theology uses, and theology and people of faith should never, ever apologize for having to use symbolic, analogical, and metaphorical language. It's not a sign of the deficiency of our religious thought, but actually instead a sign of the eminence or the greatness of that to which we're referring through our symbolic expression. And one of these symbols, I can't say too much about this, in the God religions especially, but also other religious traditions, is that of personality. If this ultimate reality is not at least personal, if this ultimate reality is an impersonal mystery or whatever, if it lacks personality, then in a sense it's smaller than we are. So at least personal, but most of the religions have recognized that personality is not enough either. So as a corrective in our symbolic discourse about God, we have all the traditions, up until modern times at least, urged us to fall into silence, that silence is perhaps the most appropriate way in which we present ourselves, our disposition with respect to ultimate reality. Before science came along, and after religions became literate, they often used the metaphor of a book to talk about the universe. But just as a book, a regular book, can be read at many different levels of meaning, so also can the universe be read at many different levels of meaning. E.F. Schumacher, in his book, A Guide for the Perplexed, says, imagine a monkey looking into a book, a great classic of literature or religion or whatever. What the monkey will see is black marks on a white page. Is the monkey wrong? No, but the book can mean more. Take a child who's just learned the letters of the alphabet and looks into the same book. We'll see something that the monkey did not see, a treasure trove of letters of a code. Is the child wrong? No, but the book can mean more. Take an adolescent who looks into a great classic and usually remains content, at least for a while, with the literal meaning of it and doesn't see what lies beneath the surface. Is the adolescent wrong? No, there is a plain sense to literature. And then take an adult, somebody who's been seasoned by life, who's undergone a transformation process simply by the process of living, and looks into the same book. I'm sure many of you have had the same experience and will see it in a whole new way as an expression of timeless wisdom. The point I'm trying to make is that traditional religions and theologies, and philosophies too, for the most part, emphasize the need for personal transformation. The medievals called it adequatio, competency, to grasp what's really going on. And that's a long process. And sometimes it involves pain and suffering, but also joy and ecstasy as well. If they were here today, representatives of these traditions, these pre-scientific traditions, would be skeptical whether science, what we call modern scientific method, is wired to detect any deeper meaning, such as cosmic purpose that they perceived in things. And no wonder, because science decided at the beginning of the modern age that it was not going to talk about God, purpose, meaning, value. It's going to leave all those things out. Science is a self-limiting method which tells us a lot of very important things about the world, but not everything. To get to the depth dimension of things, something more is required. And all the great traditions, I emphasize, said that we had to go through a personal transformation for that adequatio, that adequacy, to take place. The notion of a book also suggests another metaphor, and that's that of literalism. Just as we can be content with a plain reading of a book, so also the great traditions would say we can be content with a plain reading of the universe as well. But now, let's move away from the traditional static vertical hierarchy and look at the universe the way modern contemporary science presents it. To make a long story short, scientists tell us that we live in a roughly 14 billion year old universe. One book is probably not enough to represent what's going on in the cosmos. Imagine you have on your bookshelf, just to get a sense of the scale of this new cosmic story, 30 big books, and each of those books is 450 pages long, and each page stands for 1 million years in the story. The Big Bang would take place on page 1 of volume 1, and the first 2 shelves and most of the third, or part of the third, consist of essentially lifeless material processes and stuff. Life is not in a hurry to come into this universe. The Earth comes into existence 4.5 million years ago. Almost 1 billion years later, life begins to flame up, not terribly enthusiastically, on our planet, and remains very simple in its form until you get almost to the end of volume 29, where the famous Cambrian explosion takes place 500 to 600 million years ago, and then life begins to complexify and accelerate in complexification. Still, dinosaurs don't come in until around the middle of volume 30. Dinosaurs go extinct on page 385, which leaves only the last 65 pages for the development of mammalian life, then primates, then our hominid ancestors, and then ourselves. When do we come in? Descendants of Cro-Magnon humanity. Scientists tell us we come in only in the last fifth, perhaps the last tenth of the very last page of the very last volume. Now, if you're a thoughtful person today, and if you're religiously and theologically interested also, you can't help but ask an interesting question. What in the world is going on here? Is there any deeper meaning that we can make out in this cosmos, or is it, as Faulkner and Shakespeare would say, sound and fury signifying nothing in the end? A lot of contemporary intellectuals, very thoughtful people, would say, yes, that's all there is to it. And furthermore, they would add, hasn't the Darwinian recipe for evolution, which consists of a lot of accidents, plus the impersonal natural selection, plus lots and lots of time, doesn't that divest the universe of any significance? So the way I see the question of science and religion, I won't be able to talk much further about it here, is this. Can we map the classic sense of purpose, which was formally fixed to that hierarchical view, and keeping in mind that our religious and ethical sensibilities for centuries were sculpted in accordance with that hierarchical view? Can we map that hierarchical view or any sense of cosmic purpose onto this new cosmic story which science has very recently brought to our attention? Furthermore, does the idea of God make sense anymore? Well, as I told you, I come here as a theologian, and as a theologian, I'm part of a particular tradition, the Christian tradition. So what I urge in any conversation between Christian believers, other denominations and other religions will have their own ideas, but from a Christian point of view, start with and finish with a Christian understanding of God. Don't talk about some designer or some magician who performs design tricks or intervenes magically into the process. Start with a Christian understanding of God. And what is that? Christians are people who are told not to think about God without first thinking about the man Jesus. This is what makes Christianity distinctive from other traditions. Don't think about God without thinking about this man. And how do you think about this man? Well, you read the Gospels and you allow yourself to be transformed by them. Or you look at St. Paul in his letter to the Philippians, where he takes an early Christian hymn which pictured Jesus as being in the form of God. And as the hymn goes on to say, not clinging to that status, he emptied himself. He underwent a kenosis in Greek, an emptying, and took on the form of a slave. This is what we should have in mind when we think about God. I'm not making this up. A very conservative religious thinker, John Paul II, says this in one of his later encyclicals. The prime commitment of Christian theology is the understanding of God's kenosis, God's self-emptying, a grand and mysterious truth for the human mind which finds it inconceivable that suffering and death can express a love which gives itself and seeks nothing in return. Christians are people who are grasped by this image. It's a very powerful one and very transformative one, formative one. It changes their whole worldview, their whole way of looking at things. And my question is whether we can somehow connect this understanding of God, rather than the divine magician, to what science is telling us about the natural world. Let me just give one example of a theologian who does this. Karl Rahner, the most famous Catholic theologian probably of the 20th century, says, look, Christianity is not very hard to understand. Basically, Christians believe two big things. First of all, they believe that there's an unspeakable, incomprehensible, infinite mystery, which other traditions do also, and which we call God. But secondly, they believe that this infinite mystery gives itself away in unreserved, self-emptying, self-giving love to the finite world, to the creation. This is the meaning of the Christ event from the point of view of cosmology, according to Rahner. And that's essentially what revelation means. Revelation is not primarily biblical texts or doctrinal propositions. Revelation is primarily the self-communication of the infinite to the finite world. And by anybody's mathematics, since the finite world cannot contain the fullness of the infinite in any instant, but has to undergo a restless process of, if you want to use a Darwinian term, adapting to its ultimate environment of this infinite self-giving love, then it would not be surprising that the finite world would undergo a process of self-transcendence. Matter would transcend itself into the becoming of life, life into consciousness, consciousness into ethical and religious aspirations, and so forth. Those are all part of this self-transcending process. From the point of view of theology, that's what's going on. From the point of view of science, we can call it evolution. The point is, theology and science are distinct and compatible ways of reading the cosmic story. There's absolutely no contradiction between the two. So let me finish with this. How then do you map that hierarchical view, which was the source, the nurse of our religious sensitivities for so many centuries? How do you connect that with this new cosmic story, these 30 volumes, this 14 billion story? Another famous Catholic thinker, Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit geologist and paleontologist, during his life one of the top 2 or 3 geologists of the Asian continent, someone who started thinking about faith and evolution long before most of us were born, suggests it's not too hard. Just adjust the religious furniture in your mind a little bit. Think of God not so much as pushing creation from behind, but as inviting the universe into a new future. The God who calls Abraham into the new future, who calls the Israelites into a new future, actually calls the whole universe into the new future. And that's the ultimate explanation, theologically, of evolution. And secondly, instead of thinking of the hierarchy as a static and vertical one, think of it as an emergent story in which matter emerges and then later life, transcending matter, comes onto the scene, and then mind, and then faith, morality. Faith is the way in which the universe, now that it has reached consciousness or become conscious of itself, opens itself to a new future. So not only is religion compatible with evolution, or faith compatible with evolution, faith is the way in which we can guarantee that the evolution of the cosmos will continue into the indefinite future. Those 30 volumes could turn out to be, therefore, only the dawn of an incredible story yet to be worked out. There's a lot more to be said, but I think I'm out of time, so thank you for listening.
Jerry A. Coyne is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Chicago. Professor Coyne received his Ph.D. in evolutionary biology at Harvard University in 1998, working in the laboratory of Richard Lewontin. After a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California at Davis, he taught in the Department of Zoology at the University of Maryland and joined the faculty of the University of Chicago in 1996. Coyne's work has been mainly concerned with the genetics of species differences, aimed at understanding the evolutionary processes that produce new species. He has written over 100 referred scientific papers, as well as nearly 100 other popular articles, book reviews, and columns, as well as a scholarly book about his research area called Speciation, a book authored with H. Alan Orr. He's also written a popular book about the evidence for evolution, Why Evolution is True, published by Viking. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the New Republic, the Times Literary Supplement, The Nation, USA, and many other popular periodicals. We're delighted to welcome Professor Coyne.
Okay, so we're going to have a real debate, not an exchange of loving hugs. And I'm going to be a little bit pugnacious. Let's call it assertive rather than pugnacious, because I feel quite strongly about this issue. And my position, of course, is the opposite of John's, that science and religion are not compatible. And I'll have to speak fast and loudly and perhaps a bit assertively to try to make the point that science and religion are incompatible, and that's demonstrated by the slide there and the title that I have for tonight. By the way, thanks for that nice introduction, and to Bob and to all of you for turning out, and for those brave souls who are actually standing upwards, defying natural selection. We can overcome the tyranny of our selfish genes. So the problem that I see is the accommodation of science and religion, the view that science and religion are somehow compatible. Either they occupy different spheres of knowledge and are both ways of attaining knowledge of different sorts, or they're harmonious buddies, or, as John thinks, that they can somehow mutually reinforce each other. And I see this as not only wrong, but deeply pernicious, at least for science, if not for religion. So the problem is this accommodationism, the view that science and religion are compatible, harmonious, buddies, have a comity or whatever. It's rife in America at the present time, and you can see this by the organizations that are devoted to accommodating science and religion. The BioLogos Forum, founded by NIH Director Francis Collins, designed to convince evangelical Christians that their faith is compatible with evolution. The John Templeton Foundation, which dispenses $70 million a year and grants to scientists, but whose real purpose is the one that's circled, investing in the big questions. Big question is not Big Bang, it's like God, what's the purpose of life, etc. So this is another conflation of science with sort of religion. Scientific organizations themselves, deeply to my shame, make the same statement that science and religion are compatible. This is for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They ask fundamentally different questions about the world. Well, maybe they do, but only one of those spheres has the ability to answer those questions, and it's science. If there's no incompatibility between science and religion, which is what John maintained, and let me say that I'm going to use quotes from John throughout this talk, not to go after him personally, but for two reasons. First of all, because he's the most preeminent scholar of the compatibility between science and religion in America, and second of all, he's here to defend himself and explain his positions. If there's no incompatibility between science and faith, why do we see this in America today? Widespread opposition to evolution. 60% of Americans object to evolution. 40% believe it, many of those in a sort of watered-down way. We have organizations like BioLogos and the Templeton Foundation that are desperately trying to harmonize religion and faith. We have many new books, and I'll show you some examples later, that try to harmonize science and faith in reaction to books that say the opposite, the so-called new atheist books. If you ask Americans, 55% of them see science and religion as in direct conflict. And finally, we have this high rate of atheism amongst scientists, which is much higher than amongst the general public as a whole. And I think that says something. Here's an example of the statistics. Only 16% of Americans are agnostics or atheists. That's 1 in 6. If you look at members of elite American universities, which mine is considered one of, 72% of us are agnostics or atheists. And if you look at the members of the National Academy of Sciences, which is the most elite body of scientists in the United States, it's so elite that even I'm not a member of it. 93% of them do not believe in a personal God. They're atheists or agnostics. I think this says something about an inherent incompatibility between what the scientists are doing and what they see as religion. More statistics to demonstrate this incompatibility. This is a poll that was taken by Newsweek in 2006. If science found a fact that contradicted the tenets of your faith, what would you do? Accept the fact and give up the tenet of your faith. Accept your faith and give up the fact, or I don't know what to do. In fact, 64% of Americans would reject a well-proven scientific fact if it contravened their faith. And of course, this is what evolution is all about. More conflict between science and religion. How many people in America believe in the literal presence of angels? 78%, according to a recent poll. If you're smart, you know that there's no such thing as angels, but there is such thing as evolution. How many Americans accept evolution? Only 40%. Half of those that accept angels. So there's a problem here. The problem is of conflict between faith and religion. Why do we have this problem, which is a really hot issue now, of this conflict between science and religion? Well, one reason is because of these sort of 3 new atheist books, actually 4 if you count Dan Dennett's, which have provoked a huge and controversial response by theologians. In fact, look at all these books, and there's many more of them that have been written. For each one of these 3 new atheist books, there's about a dozen books that have been written by theologians and scholars saying, no, you're wrong, science and faith are compatible. John himself has written several of these. That's one reason. Another reason is that as science pushes forward and shrinks the borders of theology, people who want to be considered advanced and with it will accept science, but they have to do something because they don't want to give up the comforts of their faith. So they try to harmonize science and religion. There's also this view that you cannot bring religious people to a scientific point of view unless you convince them that science and religion are harmonious. So that's why accommodation has arisen. Needless to say, there's not a shred of evidence at all that any single evangelical Christian has ever accepted evolution because somebody said, well, evolution is compatible with your faith. That's not the way it works. John has given this slide. This is another reason why people are desperate to find an accommodation between science and religion, because really the lesson of science is that there's no purpose to the universe. And by purpose, I mean purpose given from the outside by some cosmic being. Stephen Weinberg has made this clear in a quote that John's already used. John has pointed out that religion simply cannot abide this purposelessness. We cannot abide the conviction that the universe and life are pointless. So if you can't abide that, then you have to find some way that they'll fit together. But this is a problem if you're not being able to accept the truth about the world rather than of cosmic dissonance. So let me talk about why. Okay, so I've showed you what the problem is and why it's pervasive and why it's happened now. Let me talk about why science and religion are incompatible in my view. So I'll talk about how science does its work very quickly, how religion does its work very quickly, and then talk about why those works are incompatible. Science, as you all know, especially if you're a scientist, is based on doubt, repeatable empirical observations by people that are substantiated by other scientists, regardless of their faith or ethnicity, replication, and falsifiability. Things have to be empirically observed and given real evidence that can be looked at and judged by other people before it's accepted as a scientific fact. And scientific knowledge grows based on confirmed or falsified hypotheses involving observations or experiments. Okay. Science is really just codified common sense. It's the most exquisite codification we have of simple common sense and how to find out stuff about the world. I think that view was expressed most eloquently by somebody that John's already mentioned, Richard Feynman. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself if you're trying to understand the universe. And you are the easiest person to fool because we're credulous, impressionable beings. So you have to be very careful about that. How do you be careful about not fooling yourself? Science is the way you do that. It's all designed to keep you from fooling yourself. Religion, on the other hand, is explicitly there to help you fool yourself. It's based on three things: dogma, authority, and revelation, not repeated or empirical observations by people of different faiths and ethnicities. Here's an example. Here's definitions of faith that I just took from the Bible. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It's basically what you want to be true rather than what is true. There's another quote from below. Religious ideas do change, as John said, but they don't change in response to any deeper understanding of God. We don't know an iota more about God than medieval theologians did because there's no evidence one way or the other. What happens is theology changes in response to two things: science showing that its assertions are wrong, like evolution or Adam and Eve, and the pressure of secular morality to make religion clean up its act, as in the case of the increasing rights of women and gays, which are forced to find the church by society themselves realizing that these groups have rights. So I've rewritten that quote from Hebrews. I am a Hebrew, although I'm an apostate Hebrew. Science is the assurance of things that exist, hoped for or not. We don't want to fool ourselves. The conviction of things that are actually seen. My own bon mot about science and religion is expressed in this: in science, faith is considered a vice. In religion, faith is considered a virtue. Those are incompatible worldviews. In science, there are ways of knowing that you're wrong. I could give you, and I will if you ask me afterwards, a list of like 15 things that would convince me that the theory of evolution is wrong. None of them have ever been observed, but I know what would show me to be wrong, as do all scientists. In religion, there's no way of knowing if you're wrong. Ask any deeply religious person what evidence would convince him that God doesn't exist. Usually they'll say none, because I know it's true. And so it's the ultimate way of fooling yourself, because you know what you believe, and nothing that you see in the world is going to change that. Now, here's a common argument. Is there some water up here? Okay, sorry. Here's a common argument for why religion and science are compatible, and it's a specious argument. It is that there is an existence of religious scientists, such as Francis Collins, head of the National Institutes of Health. Here's another one, Ken Miller, Ken Miller's a Catholic, Collins an evangelical Christian, who are scientists and yet believe in religion. There's also a lot of religious people that believe in science. So doesn't that show that these two areas are compatible? And if you think about it for a minute, you can realize, no, it doesn't show that at all. And I can use a simple example. It's like saying that Catholicism and pedophilia are compatible, because there's a lot of Catholic priests who are pedophiles. Okay, so, I mean, what that shows is not compatibility. It shows that people have the ability to hold into their minds two conflicting points of view at the same time and somehow harmonize them. Walt Whitman said it. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. So I don't think that this is proof that science and religion are compatible. I think it's proof that humans have the ability to have cognitive dissonance, as we all know. Okay. So here's the real incompatibility between science and religion. First of all, it's methodological, and John has touched on this briefly. We assume in science that there are non-divine explanations for natural phenomena, and it has always worked. We don't get anywhere by assuming that God sticks his hand in, or her hand in, at some point in the process. Because this methodology has worked, and by worked, you know that your lives have been immensely improved by science. From the very morning when you get up and your cell phone wakes you up to the antibiotics that you had, 2/3 of you guys would be dead if it wasn't for science. It works, it makes predictions, it gets us to the moon. It's all based on assuming that there are non-divine causes for natural phenomena. That has led to a philosophical point of view that there isn't anything out there that affects natural phenomena. When you get success over and over and over again in understanding the world using the natural methodology, you start to believe, well, there's not dragons influencing things, there's no elves out there, there's no God out there. There's just material processes, and it works. And finally, religion and science reach incompatible conclusions about the universe. So they're incompatible in that respect as well. There's an incompatibility of what they tell us about the universe. Here's tells us it's true about the universe. Special creation, Adam and Eve, great flood, efficacy of prayer. Theologians are going to get their way around these by saying they're metaphors, but this is what, if you look at the books that are supposedly inspired by God, and I'm talking about mostly Christianity here, this is what it tells us. It didn't have to be that way. The Bible could have told us about electrons and evolution and quantum mechanics, but it didn't. So the methods of whatever methods religion uses to investigate truth and science arrive at opposite results. Of course, the way that theologians comport this is to say, well, the Bible wasn't meant to be truthful on these issues, but 2 millennia of Christians have thought that it was. Okay. And so this is the answer that theologians give when they're faced with that. The Bible's not a textbook of science, you're going to hear. And when you hear that, just think about the translation in English. The Bible is not true, because that's what they mean when they say it's not a textbook of science. But nevertheless, when you question these theologians, and I think John would have said, that although they see much of the Bible as metaphorical and not true, there are certain non-negotiable parts of the Bible that have to be literally true. One of those is the existence of Jesus as the Son of God who is divine, and usually his resurrection, and usually the virgin birth. So some of the Bible is not a textbook of science to them, and some of it is true. No theologian has ever shown me a way to distinguish between the parts of the Bible that are true and the parts of the Bible that are metaphors. Okay? And this is another difference between science and religion. In science, we have lots of falsified claims, like cold fusion, for example. When a claim is falsified in science and everybody agrees it's bogus, it's discarded. It's put into the trash bin of bad ideas. When a claim of religion is falsified, it becomes a metaphor. And that's what's happening. All right. It's never said to be true. It just has some other meaning that we haven't grasped until the moment that science disproves it. Nevertheless, and I'm going to start using quotes from John here, and excuse me for this, but theologians do claim that they find things out about reality. And here's a quote from John's book, Deeper than Darwin. Religion, to anyone who takes it seriously, is about what is most real. So when I read this quote, I looked up the definition of reality in the Oxford English Dictionary, and it is this: what is real rather than what is imagined or desired. So I presume this claim is about an existence claim, about something that really exists in the universe. It's not something that's imagined or desired. Okay? So despite their use of metaphor, theologians do claim that they are telling us something about what is real in the universe, but they have no evidence for it. Okay, that's the big difference. Here's an example of what theologians believe. This is what a Catholic says in church every Sunday at Mass, Nicene Creed. Maybe John says this, I don't know. But it tells you what you believe. And I've put in red everything here that they have to say they believe. You believe in God, you believe that the Virgin Mary, that Christ came back and then was crucified, ascended into heaven, he's going to come back and save us. You get baptized and you're going to go to heaven. These are all claims about things that are true in the real world. And any Catholic that says this and then says, well, that's all a metaphor, I would have to ask him or her, well, why are you Catholic then if you say this in church? This is what you say you believe, and yet you say you don't believe it. So there's a problem there. So does religion really produce any truth about the universe? And I think you've heard me my spiel enough to say, no, it doesn't. I've asked my readers on my website this: can you give me an example of a single truth about the universe that has ever been produced by theological inquiry? And the answer is no. They've never produced one. Theological knowledge does not expand in the world. It's like literary criticism. It just changes stance from one place to another. It never really arrives at any more greater understanding of the divine, because it can't. Religion is supposed to answer the big questions that science can't handle. This is another quote from John from Deeper Than Darwin. It is the main business of religion to answer these big questions. What's going on in the universe? Does God exist? Why do we die? None of these questions have been answered by religion. They've offered answers, but they haven't been agreed on by other religions. As you know, every religion has a different set of answers for these questions, so it doesn't arrive at answers. It may be the business to try to answer those big questions, but it never arrives at any answers. And and theologians will actually admit this if you press them. Here's John in Deeper Than Darwin. The transience and expected death of the cosmos defy our attempts to state clearly what the point of it will be. So here he says, we don't know what it all means. And yet, I think a few minutes ago, you heard him tell us what it all means, that God is driving evolution towards some cosmic culmination in the future. I sort of want to finish with 6 ways that theology behaves unscientifically when it deals with science, and I'll give examples of each of these. What it means is how theology manages to weasel its way out of the facts about the universe. I've just given it this nice title to express that. First of all, they say that Scripture, the Bible in this case, doesn't really say what it looks like it says. Okay, it's just a metaphor in some ways. Second of all, theology isn't an honest search for truth. It's a rationalization of things that you already think are true because you got them in Revelation or you were taught them by your parents. Third of all, when you get in a tight corner, make stuff up. Okay. Fourth, if you find a new observation from science or some secular source, you have to show that it comports with God's plan from the very beginning. You make unfounded claims to understand the nature and intention of God without any evidence for making these claims. And finally, this last point, which John is not an exponent of, I know this from reading his books, that in general theologians say that if you don't agree with them on their concept of faith, you're wrong. Okay? These are all unscientific points of views because they're meant to fool you by supporting the things that you believe a priori. Here's some examples of each one. The Bible doesn't say what it seems to say. Okay? For 2 millennia, Christians literally believed in the existence of Adam and Eve as the progenitors of all humanity. Okay? Now, and in fact, a couple weeks ago in the pages of Nature, we know that this cannot be true because we know, by tracing back the genes of the human lineage, that the lowest number of people that the hominin lineage ever comprised was 1,200. Okay? It couldn't have been, it wasn't 2. It was 1,200 and no less than that, and that was about 20 to 40,000 years ago. This really puts a monkey wrench in one of the crucial tenets of Christianity, which is that these people ate a fruit given by a talking snake, and that caused well, you put it that way, it makes you laugh, but that's what the Bible says. And that eating of the fruit from the talking snake caused the original sin, which Jesus had to come back and get crucified to repent for. Okay, we know this ain't true anymore. There's 12,000 people, not 2. What does theology do? It makes stuff up. It says we didn't really mean it when we said there was 2 people. There could have been a lot more people. The Bible doesn't mention those other people. And 2 of them were designated as the ancestors of humanity. Or if you're like John, you'll go even more metaphorical and say that our complicity in evil is not an original sin. It's rather our systematic refusal to participate in the ongoing creation of the world. That was the original sin, whatever that means. I don't really understand that point of view. But what it means is, first of all, that if you see these stories refuted by science one by one in Scripture, as they have been, you start to wonder, well, maybe this book isn't right after all, or divinely inspired. But second of all, if you really believe in science, then you have to say that Jesus died for a metaphor. Because Adam and Eve are metaphors, then why did Jesus come back, get tortured, and crucified if the whole story of the original sin was just a metaphor in the first place? Rationalization of things you already believe or want to believe, the existence of an afterlife. Here's John talking about the afterlife. Now, every Christian, or most of us, including me, would like to believe in an afterlife. I don't want to think that it's the end when I go out, but I mean, that's what I'm forced to believe from the evidence. So when John talks about it in his book, The Promise of Nature, he says, where I try to elicit scientific evidence of immortality, I would just be capitulating to the narrow empiricism that underlies naturalistic belief. The translation of that is, there ain't no evidence for an afterlife, folks, so don't look for it. Instead, you have a hope for some form of subjective survival as a favorable disposition for nurturing trust in the desire to know. I'm not quite clear on what that means, but it seems to mean what Hebrews said before. What you want to be true is what you think is true. In other words, you're fooling yourself by saying that what exists is what you want to exist. Making stuff up. Why is God hidden? John has recognized that we don't see a lot of evidence for God these days. There's not a lot of miracles. We don't see Jesus walking down the streets. Lepers don't get cured. Why is that? When he was once present, it is essential to religious experience that the ultimate reality be beyond our grasp. If we could grasp it, it would not be ultimate. Now, let's submit two things here. First of all, this is tautological, because it defines the ultimate as ungraspable. If you look at the dictionary, that's not true. And the second thing is that it rests on a misunderstanding of the word ultimate, because some ultimate things are graspable. Okay? So you simply make stuff up when you say, well, why can't we see God? It's because, well, he wants to be hidden, or, it's not time for him to come and see us yet, or he's so ultimate that we can't possibly grasp him. And every theologian has a different answer for this, and we don't know what the right one is. But here's an alternative hypothesis to consider, raised by Doulos and Qu'ran, which is that the invisible and the non-existent look very much alike. Okay, maybe God is hidden because he's not there in the first place. Okay, rationalizing everything as comporting with God's plan. Why does evolution entail suffering? Theodicy, the explanation of evil, is one of the most difficult parts of theology, and I think theology is Achilles' heel, because I've never seen a theologian successfully explain to people why a beneficent, omniscient, and omnipotent God allows suffering in the world. You have to go through intellectual gymnastics to do that. These particular gymnastics are that God is caring enough to allow evolution to unfold and create this great drama of life, and everything's progressing forward, and that kind of drama of life allows the suffering that is a contingent on natural selection. Natural selection is a horrible process. It involves animals getting eaten alive. It involves infection, disease, and suffering. According to John, that is part of God's plan. So you rationalize this as something that God wants in the first place. And when I saw that quote, I thought about this quote of Gloucester from King Lear: "As wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport." I just changed that a little bit to reflect that previous view of what's happening in cosmic and natural evolution. As actors to an audience are we to the gods. They watch us for their sport. I think this is, as what I can distill, and John can correct me on this, is his view of God's plan for evolution in humans, that evil is simply a byproduct of this great drama that God has engineered, not only for our edification, but for his own amusement. Although I don't know why an omnipotent being would ever be bored. Another theological trend: comport every possible observation with religion. Here's evolution. Evolution was once the great religion killer. It is the greatest death blow that's ever been dealt to religion by science, because it does away with the most powerful argument for God, which is the design argument. Okay, so now we know that design isn't the product of God, it's the product of evolution. What do? You say, well, of course, why didn't I realize that? God used evolution to create things in the first place, and Genesis was completely wrong. Isn't it a tribute to God that the world is not just passive party in the Creator's hands, but it is an inherently active and self-creative process, one that can evolve and produce new life on its own? This is what theologians perforce are forced to do. Every time science shows one of their previous beliefs is wrong, they have to gather that in and somehow rationalize the new finding by saying, well, of course, this is what God intended all along. But if he intended it all along, why didn't he tell us in the Bible that there was evolution instead of the story of Genesis? And finally, unfounded claims to understand the nature and intention of God. Again, a quote from Making Sense of Evolution, that evolution is a product of an extravagant and divine generosity of the deity who has given us all these wonderful species, the ginkgo, the lizard, the salamander, and ourselves, of course, as the ultimate product, to become an interesting, various, and beautiful universe. Okay, that sounds good, right? But what is the evidence for it? How do we know that God is extravagant and divine? I mean, if you look around the world, you could see him as mendacious. You could see God as mischievous. You could see him as apathetic, maybe even a bit malicious. So you make claims like this, but there's no evidence behind them. So it's basically an instance of making stuff up. Finally, okay, so I hope I've convinced you, maybe, that science and faith are incompatible in many ways. Philosophical, the way they go about their business, their claims to find truth. In one case it is true, the other case there's no reason it should be true. Can there be a constructive dialogue between science and faith? And my contention is no, there cannot be a constructive dialogue between science and faith. There can be a monologue between science and faith, but it's not a constructive monologue, it's a destructive monologue. Why? Can science contribute to faith? Yeah, by disproving its claims. Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, the resurrection. Nobody yet has come back from the dead since Jesus. The Genesis story. Can faith contribute to science? Nope, because we have made all our progress in science without the necessity of relying on the supernatural, although we could have. There are scientific studies of the supernatural, like the efficacy of intercessory prayer, where scientists could indeed detect signs of God in the world. Those have all failed. So, the reliance on the supernatural to explain the world has never advanced us one iota. Theologians know this. They know that when science conflicts with religion, only one of them is going to give way, and that way is going to be religion. And they can't stand that. They cannot stand that science really has greater empirical authority than religion, and that's why they resort to those 6 methodologies of sort of weaseling out of the scientific evidence. I'm sorry to be so pugnacious, but I'm a scientist, and I have very strong feelings about the pollution of my discipline with superstition. Okay, finally, why does it matter? Why am I up here haranguing you about the fact that science and faith are incompatible? It's because faith and religion, if every religious person kept it to themselves, that would be fine with me. I would have no objection to that. It's because religion is rarely a purely personal matter. It's very different from science. In science, it's a methodology for finding out objective things about the world. And how that information is used comes from things other than science. If you discover that you can have atomic fission, if you discover an antibiotic, what do you do with it? Well, what you do with it depends on extra scientific things like ethics and morality and what you know about how those things might work. Religion is different from science. It starts with ideas about ethics and behavior that come from revelation or what you were taught. And therefore, that's a very dangerous situation because they have their handle on the truth. And so when you believe that you have handle on the absolute truth, I'm almost finished here. Well, when you think you have a handle on absolute truth, and religious people do, unlike scientists our truths are always tentative. I'd give up evolution tomorrow if somebody found a fossil human in the Precambrian sediments. If you have a handle on the ultimate truth, and you think that truth comes from God, then you're in a very dangerous situation, because then it is perforce your duty to impose that truth on the rest of the world. And that's why religion is bad. Just talking about John's own faith, here's a number of things that Catholics have done to the world because of their belief that Scripture gives them absolute truth. Opposition to birth control, opposition to condom use in Africa, because it prevents babies, but it also prevents AIDS. Total opposition to abortion. Again, these are all things that are justified by their adherence to an absolute truth that they think comes from Scripture. Opposition to divorce, many unhappy couples forced to stay together. Opposition to homosexuality, control of people's sex lives, making women into second-class citizens. They can't be priests, for example. The installation of fear and guilt in children. Many of us know Catholics who have been terrorized for their life by the thought of hell. And finally, and I think this is considered now an official policy of the Catholic Church, the protection of those priests who abuse children. So this is what happens when you think that religion is a way of finding truth, and that truth comes from God. And we don't do this in science. Okay, so real truth comes only from empirical investigation and analysis. The whole point of my talk can be summarized in this quote by Christopher Hitchens. What can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. The difference between science and religion is that science has the evidence, religion doesn't. And a final quote from Stephen Hawking: science will win, as it always has, because it works. Thanks very much.
Feel free to ask questions. I want to do a quick one for Professor Coyne. In The Descent of Man, Darwin says, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savages throughout the world, unquote. Did Darwin misunderstand his own theory, or should we wait for that eventuality?
Well, it depends. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure whether he meant exterminate them through out reproducing them or exterminating them physically. It's clear that Darwin was deeply conflicted about race. He had the racism that was typical of his time, but he also was a profound worker against slavery, as was his wife, Emma Wedgwood. Darwin was deeply confused on this issue, I think. So he made a lot of statements, and I'm not going to agree with all of them. I think in that case, I'd have to ask whether Darwin thought that the civilized races were going to outbreed the uncivilized ones, or that they were going to kill them off. And either way, I think he was wrong. I don't think there are different degrees of civilization races, but I'm not going to stand behind everything that Darwin said. So.
Succinct question to answer. John, do you want to address that, or shall we just move on?
Okay, that's fine. My question is for you, Mr. Haught. I just have to say, I think you painted a very beautiful picture of how Christianity and evolution, what the story of evolution tells us as far as evolved beings can converge together in some sort of story. You didn't give any evidence for that, and I know you didn't have much time. But my question is where does Mr. Coyne described very well, I think, a very important part of science, and that is it's very important to suspend the belief in God as a cause in order to discover whatever cause may be. And my question is, one, where does that fit into your story about God? And two, would you be willing to maintain that philosophical view and turn that on your own story?
Well, I disagreed with almost everything that Jerry said. He has a different definition for almost everything we've talked about tonight: truth, science, and so forth. But let me give you a sense of how I think a person can hold together in his or her mind these different approaches to reality. For me, it's not hard at all. But you first of all have to make or develop a taste for what I would call layered explanation. Jerry is a representative of what I would call explanatory monism. There's only one explanatory slot available for everything. And he thinks that for many centuries, theology filled that slot because science wasn't around, and that science was trying to do in a rough and now obsolete way what science can do better now. So let's get theology out of that slot, and let's put science in that slot. This postulate, this belief that he has, that there's only one explanatory slot, for which there's no evidence at all, is the fundamental basis for his whole criticism, as well as that of the whole world of scientism. Scientism is the belief, I emphasize that term, that science is the only road for truth. Science says take nothing on faith, as you just heard Jerry say, but it takes faith to accept scientism. Therefore, we shouldn't accept scientism. The logic of this is so unsurpassably watertight that really, once you say that, you've dismantled the intellectual credibility of everything that Jerry just said. Furthermore, I find myself in a rather peculiar position here of trying to defend science and the integrity of scientific investigation and inquiry against his attempt to fuse science and philosophy and faith and religion and everything else into one homogeneous smudge. I want to differentiate the two. So let me come back to the point I was trying to make. To develop a taste for layered explanation, you just first of all have to recognize that almost everything in our experience admits of a plurality of levels of understanding. The simplest example I can think of is suppose there's a kettle of water boiling on your stove in your kitchen, and somebody comes into the kitchen and says, "Why is that water boiling? Explain it to me." Well, at one level you could say it's boiling because H2O molecules are moving around excitedly and they're making the transition from the liquid state to the gaseous state. And that's a very good answer, and you could spend a whole career in physics on this very interesting phenomenon of phase transitions. But you could also have answered the question just as intelligently by saying it's boiling because my wife turned the gas on. Or you could also say it's boiling really because I want to make some tea. Now, those are three very good explanations of why the pot of water is boiling. And they don't conflict with one another. In other words, you don't say it's boiling because of molecular motion rather than because I want tea. or it's boiling because I want tea rather than because of molecular motion. That wouldn't make any sense. So likewise in science, you don't have, let me say just very, very simplistically, that theology is more like a kind of I want tea type of understanding of things. And you won't find, while you're examining the water at the molecular level, you're not going to see any I want tea at that level of understanding. Why? Because at that level of understanding, you've decided methodologically to leave out any discussion of purpose or higher meaning or deeper meaning. And that's what science does well, but scientism destroys that. Scientism makes science into a kind of theological, into an I want tea type of explanation. So the way out of this mess that Jerry gets us in, the way out of it is to differentiate very carefully between different levels of understanding. So that at one level I could say life came about because of natural selection of random variations, and I want to take that, and I want to push, I emphasize, I want to push natural explanations as far as possible. But that still leaves the possibility of a kind of I want tea, that we live in a universe in which there is a presence of love that wants the universe to become itself, to become as rich and diverse as possible, divine creativity. There's no contradiction whatsoever between a theological way of understanding the universe and a scientific way.
Okay, next question.
Hey, John, this question's for you as well. As a former religious person, I can definitely appreciate what you're doing. You just mentioned that. But I was a little bit surprised to see that you, I guess, invoked purpose as your evidence for religion, because I can think of a lot of ways, I guess, for there to be purpose without religion. But that aside, personally, I think that things like bioinformatics, molecular biology, cosmology, and stuff does point to a God. That's where I differ. I'm not an atheist, I'm a deist. But my question is, tradition, culture, and social influences aside, when you look at the world and the universe around us, I guess, where do you see the evidence for a loving God? Not evidence for a logical or even creative God, but a loving one. Where do you see that?
We're going to have to get a little more succinct, or we're going to be here all day.
Okay, well, first of all, what do we mean by evidence? Evidence is a term that's been thrown around here by you, Jerry. But there are different kinds of evidence.
Okay, that's enough. Please, can we just have an answer to the question?
There are different kinds of evidence. There's the kind of evidence that we associate with spectator evidence, which science uses. It's publicly shareable, easily accessible, kind of evidence that doesn't require much personal cost to you. You can just read a book or do an experiment, look at a test tube to find that kind of evidence. The kind of evidence that I'm talking about from a religious point of view is, as I mentioned in the word transformation, it's transformative evidence. It's the evidence that comes from encountering something which is so powerful, so overwhelming, so beautiful, so true, so good, that it carries you away. That's evidence too, but it's not the kind you can get your mind around. Go back to the hierarchical view that the traditional religions had. The higher levels can encompass the lower cannot encompass the higher. So there's not the same kind of evidence when we talk about religious experience as we do when we talk about science. But the evidence for God is I mentioned in my understanding of God, is for Christians, and we can only speak about this from our own religious experience. We don't want to pick the idea of God from some rag bag of ideas that's out there. From a Christian point of view, our sense of God has been shaped by our experience and encounter with the tradition that takes us back to the Christ as self-giving love. That's the evidence.
This is a question for both of you, because I'm not positive that science won when the Pope showed Galileo the instruments of torture some years ago. And nor am I sure that science is going to win in stem cell research, nor in the creationist battles that are being fought across the country. And unfortunately, I'm sure that science didn't win when the super collider that was planned for Texas wasn't built. So I'm curious, what's your best advice for, one, helping you pursue the truth through government procedures, and also for what recommendation do you have for your audience to help us help politicians pursue the truth as well?
That's a lot of questions. I'll try to answer briefly. What I meant by win is not that the public's always going to accept science, because, of course, 40% of Americans, evolution doesn't work for them. What I mean is it wins, it helps us understand nature to scientists and ultimately to people who take the trouble to learn about science. So, yeah, Galileo had to recant when he showed the instruments of torture, but he's won now. We know that the sun is the center of the solar system. So all I can say is that the job of the scientist is to find out, to the best of their ability, what is true about the universe, with evidence, although John seems to have distorted the notion of the word evidence that not only scientists use, but also all of us use. What's the evidence that my wife is cheating on me? You don't say, well, Revelation tells me. You hire a private detective, or you look for photographs and stuff like that. That's evidence. Evidence is not what you make up by observing the world and say, well, this is true because I want it to be true. What a scientist should do is look for that kind of evidence, which is evidence gained through your senses, common sense, but also can be replicated and agreed upon by everybody else. That's our job. It's also our job to promulgate what we find to the general public and hope that they understand it. It's not necessarily our job to tell them what to do with that evidence. That is for people like bioethicists.
Just go on to the next question. There's so many people in line here. So.
Well, thank you for coming.
I'm
right here. So first, I would like to offer a quick comment that in the teapot analogy, you could explain the human's desire chemically if we understood consciousness more, but you could never explain God's will chemically, and that has something to do with the non-overlapping nature. But my question is for Professor Haught, and I know that you talked a little bit about emergent evolution, so I'd be interested if you could talk a little bit more about where it leads to, and where all of the collective suffering that we experience, what it results in. And if you cannot explain that, if it's only metaphorical, I might offer a metaphor of my own and sort of ask if we could not use Occam's razor to cut away the emperor's clothes.
Well, let me talk about Occam's razor, because that's what Jerry seems to be following here. Occam's razor that was formulated by a medieval monk, William of Occam. And basically what it says is if you have a plurality of competing explanations, a good rule of thumb is to take the simpler one rather than the more complex type of explanation. So when I talk about a plurality of levels of understanding, some people might be tempted to apply Occam's razor to that. But the key point in Occam's formulation was when you have competing explanations. My whole point of the analogy was to show there are many kinds of explanations which in no way compete. Like I said, you don't say that water is boiling because of molecular motion rather than because I want tea. There can be a kind of layering of explanation in which they're not competitive, but which following the kind of curiosity or inquiry that's proportionate to each level, you can end up with a much richer picture of reality than you can with explanatory monism. Explanatory monism is an irrational way compared to explanatory pluralism. You have a much better chance of capturing the full texture of reality if you allow for a whole plurality or stack. I've just mentioned 3 levels of understanding, rather than decide by an act of fiat, by a decree, which is what Jerry's giving, a decree that we should accept as explanation, as valid explanation, or we should accept as truth only what scientific method puts us in touch with. That's so ironic, because scientific method starts out with the agreement that it's not going to talk about I want tea type of questions. So if it's not methodologically wired to receive that kind of evidence, if you want to call it that, then why would anybody want to say that science is the only road to truth?
Professor Coyne, do you want to comment on that before we get to the next question?
A couple.
Quickly.
First of all, John postulates that there's a layer underneath evolution of the universe, and he hasn't given us a single bit of evidence for that. There's a layer beyond God. You know, who made God? I mean, it's turtles all the way down. We have evidence up to the Big Bang. We don't have any evidence for layered. And so you can say that there might be layers, and the explanation might be richer, because that's what you want it to be richer, but that doesn't mean that that layer is really there in the first place. Second of all, I've just mentioned, I guess John didn't hear it, that science can test the supernatural. We don't rule out supernatural causes from the beginning in science. That's a misunderstanding. we have discarded them over time because they have not proven necessary. Every test of whether the supernatural exists has shown that it doesn't. ESP, intercessory prayer, etc. It's that ruling out of God that has led many of us philosophically to say, well, we can't see it over and over again. We have to discard it.
Dr. Coyne, I have a question. First off, your slide on the Nicene Creed was incorrect.
Sorry, what?
Your slide on the Nicene Creed was incorrect. Roman Catholics say we believe, not I believe. I believe is the Apostles' Creed. And
well, I took it from Wikipedia.
In the latter, how?
Okay. Sorry.
Oh.
Okay, even so.
I was going to say, because it says he will come to judge the living and the dead, not the quick and the dead.
There's two versions. You realize there's two versions of the Nicene Creed, right?
Right, but I don't think it said to judge the quick and the dead. That's a Clint Eastwood film.
I'm not going to say I agree with you. I ran that past two of my Catholic friends, and they said, "Yep, that's what I said."
My question is,
okay.
What is your response to Dr. Haught's notion that perhaps humans have not evolved to the point where we can understand God? If we are continually evolving, both physically and mentally, perhaps we haven't evolved to a point where we can understand, all of us as a society, understand God and faith.
Well, if we haven't gotten to that point, we should shut up about it. That's all I say.
Dr. Coyne, I'll stand up. This question's for you. If you could briefly, for the sake of Dr. Rabel's blood pressure,
a very important consideration.
Describe the process by which you abandoned your faith.
Normally I would say it's not relevant, because I was talking about science and religion and philosophy. But yeah, I mean, it's clear that I'm an atheist. Anybody that Googles me will find that in half a second. The process for which I abandoned my faith was very instantaneous, and it was described in an article in the Chicago Tribune by a reporter who surveyed scientists about why they were atheists. It happened to me right after the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album came out. I was sitting in my parents' house. I think this was 1967. And I was sitting on the couch of my parents' house. I had always believed in God. My father told me, look, if you're bad, God's going to punish you. I went to synagogue, although I wasn't really into it. I was brought to believe in God. And then I was listening to Sgt. Pepper in June of 1967. I'm not sure that's the right date. And it just hit me all of a sudden that everything I had ever been told, there was no evidence for it. And so for about 5 minutes, I was in really bad shape. I said, oh, God, I'm going to die. I'm not going to go anywhere. I started sweating. I was shaking. And then I was all right after that. And I've been all right after since. So it's not a really profound story. It's sort of an unusual way to abandon your faith. It's not the way most people do, which is a tortuous process. It involves losing friends and family and this painful way of giving up beliefs and clawing your way into rationality. But that's the way it happens. So.
Hi, I have a question for Mr. Haught. You were talking about ultimate reality and sort of a one cosmic purpose idea. And I've always thought in fact, it's been my experience that, and I'd like somebody to do this on a university level sometime, take a survey of Christians, put 100 Christians in a room and ask them to write down the characteristics of God, what God does, doesn't do, means, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you'd have 100 different answers. And what I'm thinking when you're talking about ultimate reality, my question for you is, do you think there's one ultimate reality or cosmic purpose, or are there as many as people who are contemplating it?
Well, by definition, something that's ultimate has to be one, and everything else is penultimate in relation to that. And that's how traditional theology has understood God, as the ultimate and therefore as unique. That's a hard thing for a lot of people to understand, because by nature, religious scholars tell us we are polytheistic. And I think that's true. We do tend to get carried away by things which are not ultimate. And that is what the traditional religions have referred to as idolatry. And idolatry is rejected by these religions because it's an imprisonment. Idolatry wraps us around things that are too small for us. I believe with St. Augustine that we are all born with a capacity for the infinite. And that's why we're never fully satisfied with anything that's less than ultimate. And there is empirical evidence for that. It's called shopping. We're never fully satisfied because of this As Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they rest within the infinite itself, or the ultimate, or the absolute. So I think we have by nature a sense of the absolute, and even people who call themselves atheists have this a tacit sense of the absolute. For example, when Jerry listed all the bad things about Catholicism, behind that was a tacit sense, this is not right. This is wrong. You can't really have a powerful sense of what's wrong unless you silently place it against the horizon of what is right. And what I mean by religion is the explicit recognition that there is a rightness, that there is an absoluteness, and that this is tacitly present in almost everything we do, including the question that you just asked. I take this question as totally sincere because you are interested. You believe that truth is worth seeking. And that's a powerful belief that many of us have. And I would wager that Jerry has this too, not only in his science, but in his atheism too. If Richard Dawkins, for example, was asked recently on a talk show, why do you do this? Why do you write all these books about atheism? Why do you go around the world making these talks? And he said one word, truth. But you know, classically, that's another word for God. God is truth itself, just as God is goodness itself. Even though explicitly we might reject the idea of God, oftentimes our rejection of God is in the name of an absolute or an ultimate, or something to which we are committed personally, something which we are not willing to surrender, something which we might even be willing to die for. So what theology is simply making explicit this dimension that I think almost all of us, I don't want to say all of us, but almost all of us have as a tacit context or horizon for almost everything we do and say in the world of belief.
This question is for Dr. Coyne. If the supernatural by definition are things outside the physical realm, then why would we try to use physical science and physical evidence in order to prove the existence or explain the intricacies of the supernatural?
That's a very good question. I don't think the supernatural is outside the natural realm. I think many people misunderstand supernatural as something that's not possibly be investigated by science. That natural means can't be brought to discover. I give you two examples of how scientists have tried to investigate the supernatural. Intercessory prayer. If you pray for somebody, do they get better faster? You can do this with Indians when they do rain dances to bring rain. You could test that. You could see if ESP works. There's any number, because John is a theist, like many religious people, and thinks that God interacts with the world in direct, empirically observable, testable ways. If you make that claim, then the mechanisms of science can be brought into. I mean, you could see if people could be born from virgins, or that they could come back after being dead for 3 days. You could see if there's only 2 humans in the history of the world. Now, some of those claims are beyond our ability to investigate because they're supposedly they only happened once. But things like the Great Flood, evolution, and Noah's Ark, and Adam and Eve, those are claims about the supernatural. And they've been investigated by science and refuted. So I really don't like the word supernatural. I like the word divine, that there's something beyond the physical world that can influence the physical world. Now, if you're a deist and you think that there's just some power that set the whole thing in motion and took the hands off, then there's really no way that we can investigate that as scientists. But most religious people are not deists, they're theists. They think that God actually does something, and those things that God does are perforce within the ambit of scientific investigation.
Can I just say everything Jerry has said tonight about theology is a caricature. I mean, I can't think of any exception to that. Jerry, you're an empirically minded person. Isn't it part of the empirical spirit, before you make generalizations about phenomena, that you examine as many of them as you can? You've got to get out more. You haven't talked in any realistic sense about anything that I believe or do as a theologian. You get your theology from visiting the websites and the campsites of creationists and some intelligent design people. Your God is a caricature, a cartoon deity. I don't believe in your God either. I'm just as much an atheist as you are, as far as what your understanding of God is concerned. So what's the way to resolve this problem? The way is by taking seriously, looking carefully at what people say, and don't caricature them. Every quote he had was taken out of context of my writings. Almost everything he said about me as a theologian is something I don't identify with. So we can't really have a conversation unless we first of all have the good manners to look carefully at the writings and the ideas and the context out of which I come.
I hate to disappoint people. Let's have one more question, and then the speakers have to be elsewhere. But if you want to come up after this last question and duke it out with the speaker of your choice, that's fine with me.
This may be just slightly off topic, but I really like Professor Coyne's opinion on this. If the universe is rational and follows laws and rules and therefore would be said to be deterministic, can there be free will?
My answer is no, I don't think there is free will, because what we have in our head is just a lump of matter that has to obey physical laws. Our brain is our thoughts and our minds, and it has to obey laws. Let me make one response to John's comment, because I really don't like being told that I need to get out more. First of all, I read 6 of John's books in preparation for this debate. You can read them yourself. I recommend you do that. I think I've accurately characterized his views. Second of all, if you go to the south side of Chicago and get out there, you will find that there are many, many people who absolutely believe in the literalness of all of those things. They're not metaphors. There's a real Jesus who was really crucified. We're going to go to heaven after we die. Sophisticated theologies, such as John purveys, is not the way most Americans are religious. So when somebody of that stripe says this is what religion is, he's saying, Americans, you're all wrong about religion. And I think that, with due respect, John, I think you need to get out more too. So.
As a theologian who has already been quoted tonight, Woody Allen once said, "How can people hope to discover the ultimate secrets of the universe when it's hard enough finding your way around Chinatown?" So at least we have left the realms of Chinatown this evening if we have not settled all questions about ultimate reality. I want to thank both of our speakers.